my case study was titled Apple Eye Problem, Subcontractor Workers Issues Bring Negative Attention. And some background before the New York Times article was published. In 2006, news media reported on Foxconn mistreating their employees. And news media at this time was very restricted into the Foxconn facilities, so the resources and insight was a bit limited. And the very first audit completed by Apple was published in 2007 about the year 2006, and it noted the situation and the negative news media coverage. And this began yearly published audits from Apple that did continue to uncover many violations at Foxconn facilities. And criticism began to grow at this point as the mistreatment continued to be documented throughout, and news media began following it throughout the years. And Apple's response to the mistreatment, was meetings that established corrective action plans. However, the mistreatment at Foxconn continued to grow and worsen. And then jump ahead to 2010, there were noted at least 10 suicides occurred at Foxconn facilities, among other health and safety issues. And then the following year, in 2011, an explosion occurred at a Foxconn facility, which was noted due to dangerous chemicals that were being used. And some of their employees were injured or killed due to this. And Apple's audit then unveiled 36 core violations at 127 Foxconn facilities. And the audit did also address the suicides and injuries and other illnesses. And Apple's response to this was that they eliminated the use of dangerous chemicals, and they implemented medical care and monitoring of affected workers. However, later on it was found that Foxconn still used dangerous chemicals in some of their facilities. And Apple also hired top suicide prevention experts that met with both Apple and Foxconn at the time, so that they could put in plans on how to address these issues. And Foxconn offered more healthcare centers, counselors, and they installed large nets around their buildings. And then some of the principal players and key stakeholders in this, from what I would think is most involved to least involved, would be Apple, which includes the CEO Steve Jobs at the time and Tim Cook. And then following them would be Apple's major suppliers, which includes Foxconn and their CEO. And then I would say is the Fair Labor Association. Following them, I would say the factory workers. After them, I would say the news media, because they were the ones who followed and documented and unveiled information throughout the whole situation. And in turn, they pressured Apple and Foxconn to respond, since they were initially silent at the time. And then lastly, I would say partly American consumers, because it was mentioned in the case as they had a small part, because they led petitions for changes and strikes outside Apple stores. So what happened? So in the case, it noted that on January 13th, 2012, Apple published a news release that detailed their efforts in labor and human rights, worker health and safety, and environmental impact, as well as their code of conducts, auditing reports, and education development initiatives. And this was partly in response to the fact that they were under some kind of scrutiny and were being followed for how their suppliers were mistreating their employees. And then on January 21st, 2012, Apple for the first time published their list of suppliers, which was secret prior to this, which also led to criticism and suspicion on their part. And they also announced their membership in the Fair Labor Association. And then following that, a couple of days later, on January 26, 2012, New York Times published an article exposing the conditions of Foxconn workers, which was one of Apple's major suppliers. And it showed how they were being mistreated, and it confirmed a lot of what was happening before, but maybe not followed as closely or as well known as it now was. And Apple CEO Tim Cook responded to the article with a company-wide email that expressed his concerns for employees at all points in the supply chain. And then the next month, in February 2012, the Fair Labor Association launched their own independent investigation into labor rights delegations at Foxconn, and they published their news release with this information on March 19th, 2012. And the ultimate resolution, it was noted in the case that Apple's 2013 Supplier Responsibility Progress Report discussed a 7-year effort to share good and bad audit findings. And another part would be that the Fair Labor Association investigation report, stated Foxconn said they were committing to reducing working hours to legal limits while protecting pay, improve health and safety conditions at Foxconn facilities, and establish a genuine voice for employees, and will monitor on an ongoing basis to verify compliance. And this was partly in the Apple Supplier Responsibility Report. They did say that they would follow and check up on Foxconn more than I guess they had in the past, or they claimed they were and maybe weren't looking as closely. And throughout their report, they had a similar response to as Foxconn did. And in this instance, why was PR needed? Well, it was noted that one of the Foxconn managers, Louis Wu, he said that to a news media reporter that a PR company was never hired because the Foxconn CEO at the time, they were doing like top or very well in their company. So he thought, well, if there's no issues and there's no one, I guess, coming after them at the time, that it wasn't needed. But at the same time, the silence and secrecy that was surrounding Foxconn and Apple to a point, it could have been handled better, as them being silent and very secretive led to suspicion and then started this whole issue. And while the news media narrowed its focus on the issues at Foxconn, I think a PR department or a company could have properly responded and disclosed information that should have been in the beginning. And it could have protected both Apple and Foxconn's reputations. And a PR department or a company could have utilized and strategized better, and could have looked more organized as like a damage control kind of department. Because, like, for instance, if they created a plan on how to really respond to the news media rather than remain silent and disclose information more than they did, or let in more news media, or didn't give very vague information to news media, I think that it could have made them look more transparent and trusted. And then some of the strategies and tactics that were used by Foxconn and Apple included strategic inaction, vocal commiseration, and rectifying behavior strategies. And the strategic inaction or silence strategy was the initial one that was used until the responses came from Apple and Foxconn. And I didn't think that this was necessarily effective because it made them look even more suspicious and secretive and just not as transparent. And I think that if they were to avoid that as much as they could have, then it might not have made them look as bad as they did. And then following that, the vocal commiseration strategy. So at several points throughout, Apple and Foxconn did express their concerns, condolences, and regrets. And they also expressed their resolutions in part of this. And then lastly, the rectifying behavior strategy. There were numerous investigations, including the major one from the Fair Labor Association, which resulted later on in corrective action plans from Foxconn and Apple. For example, Foxconn introduced more psychological benefits for employees, and Apple met with Foxconn leaders to confirm follow-through from Foxconn and my theory and strategy recommendations. So I thought that the excellence theory would be useful to them, and it involves a two-way communication between organizations and their publics. And rather than remain Apple and Foxconn against the public or against the employees, one against the other, I think that if Apple and Foxconn did appropriately address their publics from the beginning, including their employees and news media, and just any other of their publics. This would have minimized the appearance of them being untrustworthy, and it could have curtailed escalation. And I think that remaining clear and truly acting on the promises and follow through with the changes that they said they were going to do, it would have helped to recover their reputation. Then the other recommendation I had was the situational theory of publics, which builds strategic relationships for an organization that involves understanding their publics. And the steps to this are awareness, and then how the issue affects people's lives, and the ability to do something about the problem. So I think that if the problem originally was recognized and addressed sooner rather than later, then I think Apple and Foxconn would have been able to and had more time to understand how their publics, mostly their employees, were being mistreated, and how that this was something that escalated over a long period of time. So if they caught it sooner, it might not have escalated or gone as far as it did. And then lastly, Apple and Foxconn's responses to the situation could have been mobilized sooner, and they could have just avoided this situation and not let it get as far as it did. And so then at the same time, if I were in the PR agency or department in this case, I think I would have done several different approaches, including the excellence theory and the situational theory of publics. And I think that rather than remaining silent in the initial start of this, I would have created a formally written response as soon as possible to avoid this from escalating, because I think that Apple and Foxconn remaining silent made it look like that they were trying to think of what to say and trying to come up with a good answer. But it did just make them look a lot more suspicious than they already did. And it made them look like they were trying to cover up information, because they did have a background of being very secretive until this point. And I also would have made sure that Foxconn did follow through on their promises for the betterment of their employees, like raising wages, and they offered proper health care and appropriate working hours, especially considering that this was something that started several years before 2012, and that it was ongoing and did escalate as far as it did. And I think that in 2005 or 2006 or so, whenever it did start, if a PR agency or department was utilized then, maybe by 2012 this wouldn't have happened. And I think that both Apple and Foxconn could recover from the situation by formally apologizing for letting this go on for so long and letting this happen in the first place. And if they do remain transparent with their publics and establish corrective action plans that they do truly follow through with, I think then that their reputation will recover over time, and they will gain the trust back of their publics. And it was mentioned in Apple's 2013 Supplier Responsibility Progress Report. It did include their promise of transparency, which I think was important. And then updates regarding this. So the first update following this case in 2012, there was 5 months of damage control PR that was completed by Apple. And although they were not extremely specific in their reported update, they stated that they would invest more funding into Foxconn to create a better working environment for their employees, but they did not disclose how much and how the money will be distributed, which I think hurt them in a way because it made them look not transparent. And they only described their initial improvement plan, so they didn't even really offer a follow through or how they were going to go further after the initial beginning. And there were many critics of this, and they said that it was an empty gesture and an empty response. And later Apple completed and published their audits, which critics also thought were publicity stunts. And then only just a couple years ago in 2018, there was a New York Times article that Foxconn was again under scrutiny for employment practices, so it was the same thing over again. And a Foxconn factory violated employment laws where they weren't paying sick or holiday pay. They laid off workers without wages during slow times of production, and then they weren't paying overtime, and they were abusing student workers. and they also had too many agency workers than they were allowed. And Apple's response to this was that they requested an immediate corrective action plan from Foxconn, but Foxconn responded that they were investigating the situation. And then as of last year, Apple and Foxconn confirmed allegations and said they would pay what was actually earned to the workers,